All right. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us on this beautiful day here at the Jordan Center. We're delighted today to welcome Ben Nathans, professor of history at Penn, and Jen Wilson, staff writer at the New Yorker, to discuss Professor Nathans' new book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. Professor Nathans is the author of an earlier monograph, Beyond the Pale, that focused on the history of Jewish history in the revolutionary, or excuse me, in the imperial era. I should be looking at my notes. And has subsequently turned not just to public writing, but to this magisterial history of the Soviet dissident movement, a work that combines social science with philosophy and legal history. All right. Yeah, and international history as well as personal writing in a very unique way. We're so lucky to have Jen Wilson here to discuss it with him, who has not only, as I mentioned, a staff writer at the New Yorker, but a PhD in Slavic languages and literatures in an earlier life. And we are grateful to both of you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for asking me to be in conversation with you. I'm a little surprised just because my academic expertise was a bit far from this. My dissertation was on chastity in an 18th century Russian novel. A little different, but then I remember my on-the-ground reporting on the 2012 protests, reporting. I was taking a language class, and every week we had to find a news story somewhere in the Russian media, and then put it in our own words and present it to the class. And I remember sort of thinking, oh, there are these three women. They were arrested at a church. They were a punk song. And I thought that was the extent of that was going to be the extent of Pussy Riot's Western coverage with my little book report. That was quite wrong. But I was reading this book again, I was wondering if that 2012 as if that was trying to fit that in some sort of context was the impetus for this book. Or you had already been working on it, how that moment maybe affected your trajectory.
Sure. First, I just want to say thank you for being here. I think, like a lot of people, I rarely am able to read the New Yorker cover to cover. There's just too much every other week. But when there's an essay or an article by Jen Wilson, I make damn sure that I read that. And I really appreciate what you're doing there. So my history with this topic goes back more years than I'd like to say, because it took a long time to research and write this book. It goes back before the 2011 demonstrations. In fact, it goes back to an era when the topic of dissent in the Russian Federation under Putin really was not something that many people thought was an issue. This was the early years of the first decade of this century. That's how long I've been working on this. Instead, I was really driven by a more generic interest in how people who live in authoritarian or creeping authoritarian societies construe their political options for public engagement and how they act on those options once they've decided what they are. And that was a question that applies to a lot of different places, but I was trained as a specialist in Russia and the Soviet Union, so that was always going to be where I focused my efforts. And the dissident movement was covered quite well, I would say, in real time by journalists, Western journalists posted in Moscow. Many of them interviewed a lot of the key players. The Western coverage itself actually had an impact on the movement's evolution, not always in good ways, but in ways that were consequential. And at some point I realized, okay, so, the cliche about journalism is that it's the first draft of history. And now is the time to write something beyond the first draft. And that's when I started getting into the archival research and interviewing people. But the question that I began with always remained present in my mind. How did the dissidents think about political action and political activism? But that question had to be modified over the course of the research once I realized that they didn't think they were political activists at all. They didn't think that dissenting in the Soviet Union was, at least the way they did it, was political activity. As a matter of fact, they were adamant about being apolitical, which is sort of the first paradox that kind of hit me as I was making my way into this topic. And once I realized that that was the way they looked at things, that opened up a whole new set of perspectives.
Not at all relevant right now.
Yeah, I mean, the book became politically relevant in our own country in ways that I had not anticipated.
Yeah. I mean, you were supposed to do this event last September, and then I got sick, I had COVID, and then I had to reschedule it for now, and I was looking at it again, and I thought, oh gosh. I'm almost sure glad this got delayed because the book has, a relevance and resonance with me now that where before, but now it feels a bit like sort of a manual for kind of how to imagine, political activity in day-to-day life. You write that yes, it's relevant to us, but you also talk about how the dissident movement was, really, indigenous to the Soviet Union, that these were children of the Soviet system, and that the way that they expressed, dissent was uniquely Soviet. Can you say what you meant by that?
Yeah. So I think coming into this question of who are the dissidents and what is this movement that they made, I think there's a temptation, especially if you're American, as I am, to see them as sort of outposts of Western liberalism. They seem to talk the language of civil liberties. They do talk the language of civil liberties, the rule of law, and it's easy to fall into the trap of projecting your own political values and political aspirations onto these brave individuals who were dissidents. This is a serious American problem, a kind of homegrown solipsism that wants to see dissenters in other countries as versions of ourselves. And in the Soviet case, it's really quite pernicious because it ends up missing what I think is the most crucial ideas that they developed that show that they were not just garden variety liberals who had the misfortune of being born on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. They were, as you said, Soviet people, products of the Soviet system. And that once it seems like a banal thing to say because, obviously they were born in the Soviet Union, they all went to Soviet schools, they were all surrounded by the force field of Soviet ideology, which was kind of omnipresent in people's lives, on billboards, on television, in the mass media, in school, everywhere. But it's a little less banal if you try to understand the movement that they made as a Soviet civil rights movement. And that's really one of the arguments that the book tries to make, is that this was a Soviet civil rights movement. And what I mean by that is that the nature of the high-mindedness and the idealism that dissidents brought to their activism was very much a product of their Soviet upbringing. And their emphasis on leveraging Soviet law, the Soviet Constitution, the Soviet Code of Criminal Procedure, in order to place constraints on what the Soviet state could and could not do, deployed a quintessentially Soviet institution, the legal institution. So once you see how many of the ingredients from which the movement was baked really come from the Soviet setting, then a lot of things start to make more sense than if you begin with the assumption that they were Western liberals who just ended up on the wrong side of the Cold War. The thing that really convinced me in the end that I needed to look at this as a Soviet phenomenon was when I started comparing this dissident movement with movements that came to life, usually a little bit later, with a bit of a time lag, in other Soviet-style systems. So if you compare the Soviet dissident movement with the movements in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and Romania, and the People's Republic of China, you find fundamental congruence in terms of their platform, in terms of their modus operandi, in terms of the kind of people who populated the movement, their social location, their degrees of education. There are variations depending on local circumstances, but there's a remarkable uniformity in the nature of dissent around the Soviet world, or I should say the Second World, the ensemble of states that constituted the Second World during the Cold War. There's just a remarkable congruence among those movements, the emphasis on rule of law, the emphasis on nonviolence, on not toppling the state, but constraining what the state can do. All of these things are fundamental, whether it's the Solidarity Movement or Charter 77 or the Chinese variant, which has a high proportion of lawyers in its ranks, whatever. Soviet systems seem to generate similar kinds of dissident movements. And that's why one of the other main arguments that I try to make is that every orthodoxy breeds its own specific heresy. And the Soviet orthodoxy gave rise to a specific dissident heresy, of which the movement was the embodiment.
The term dissident is a foreign term. How did the dissidents describe themselves? What was the language that they used to describe who they were and what they were doing?
Almost without exception, people who we call dissidents really did not like that word. They really disliked it. And we know this because they said so. Solzhenitsyn, from his exile in Vermont, starting in 1975, I think, wrote in a private letter to Ronald Reagan after he was invited to the White House, "I am not a dissident, I'm not an exile, I'm a Russian writer." And when a visiting American in Moscow, who found himself, this is Edward Klein, the late, great Edward Klein, who lived in New York City and was a great friend to the movement. When he was in the apartment of Andrei Sakharov and Elena Bonner in Moscow, in, I believe it was the early 1980s, he once just casually referred to Sakharov as a dissident, at which point Bonner cut him off and said, "My husband is not a dissident, he's a physicist." So why did they not like this term, which was so widespread and which most Western people treated then as now as a kind of badge of honor? They didn't like it, first of all, because it was foreign. And it made the image of dissidents as a foreign element, or as an element somehow controlled or influenced by foreigners, or controlled or influenced by foreign intelligence services like MI6 and CIA. It made that even more plausible, because the term was taken over as a calque into Russian, where it was dissident, dissidentskaya. So automatically, that term branded them as being linked to something outside the Soviet Union. And in fact, the term was weaponized by the KGB precisely for that purpose. But quite apart from how it was weaponized, they didn't like the term because the literal meaning of dissident, it comes from the Latin. And what it means literally is a dissident is someone who sits apart from other people, who self-segregates. That's why its original application was to religious sectarians who did literally self-segregate from the mainstream, mostly Christian denominations that they were trying to differentiate themselves from. So dissidents really didn't like that image of people who went off to a corner to sulk or do God knows what, because they considered themselves the most engaged citizens in the entire Soviet population. They thought they were putting themselves out there front and center to take a position on issues of the day. So just on a purely semantic level, the word doesn't work as a descriptor of the people that it purports to describe. You asked what they call themselves or how they would have preferred to have been labeled. So here there were various options. I think the favorite term, at least to the best of my ability to figure it out, the favorite term amongst dissidents themselves was other thinkers, or in Russian, inachievable, which is, I had to practice a long time to be able to say that. It's not an easy word to pronounce. It's a long word, so it's not a great label for anybody who wants to be active in the public sphere to use. And I myself think it's an even worse descriptor of what so-called dissidents were and what they were up to, because it means other thinker. But dissidents, the people we call dissidents, stood out not because they thought differently, but because they spoke up differently. They acted differently. So it's not a very useful term, I think, if you wanted to actually convey information about what makes those people distinct. Another term that they liked, and that I also like, is правозащитник, or rights defender. really captures the activity of the people that I tried to bring to life in this book. They were defending rights that were already enshrined in the Soviet Constitution. And many of them would have preferred to be known as rights defenders. So why weren't they known to history as rights defenders? Because the people who got to label them, and this is a sign of the balance of power in the Cold War world, the people who got to label them originally were Western journalists. It was Western journalists stationed in Moscow, some of them quite prominent because that was a golden posting. If you were a journalist for the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times or the Chicago Tribune or the Miami Herald, the Moscow posting was just a plum position during the Cold War. And they were the ones who eventually started using this term dissident to describe the people that they were beginning to cover. And the Soviet government was only too happy to take over that term and weaponize it precisely because it was foreign and came from the West. And it's a barometer of the power of the Western gaze and of Western coverage of this movement as it was unfolding, that's the term that ultimately stuck. I thought long and hard about whether I should use it because I didn't want to just reproduce the inaccuracies and the misleading connotations that come with it. And in the end, I gave in because it is so embedded in the literature and in contemporary documents. And the dissidents also gave up, and they would refer to their movement as the dissidents of Virginia. So I faced a choice of using a term that was far from perfect or adopting a language that was so estranged from contemporary practice that it put me at great remove from my protagonists. And I like to be close to my protagonists. I don't want to be hostage to them and the way they think, but I like to be close to them. So I use dissident.
How do you date the beginning of the dissident movement? I find this really hard in my own work. I mean, I'm not a historian, but often when I'm writing a feature story, I have to give sort of a small historical sketch, maybe of an industry or a trend. And the hardest part for me is located at the beginning. I started to believe that the beginning is a myth. I'm curious how you struggled with that, or sort of deciding when to sort of say it started here, it started then.
Yeah, I'm going to roll with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Movements need myths. So I take the movement's own myths about itself seriously. I don't treat them as, history capital H, but myths are part of how movements and people make sense of their own pasts to themselves. And the mythology of the dissident movement tells us that it has a birthday. There's a day in the calendar, Sunday, December 5th, 1965, the anniversary of the ratification of what was then the Soviet Constitution. December 5th, 1936, specifically, the day the so-called Stalin Constitution came into effect. And it was that text that contained the civil liberties that the dissidents were convinced would give them a certain leverage in their campaign for the rule of law and legality and end to the arbitrary terror inflicted on the Soviet population by the Stalin regime. So what happened on December 5th, 1965? That was the first time that a so-called transparency meeting was held, meeting glasnost. It was the brainchild of an eccentric mathematical logician in Moscow, a man named Alexander Sergeyevich Singh. He's the one who came up with the legal strategy for the movement, and he was the principal organizer of this public demonstration, which was reacting to the recent arrest of two Soviet writers, people who had written under pseudonyms, published their fiction abroad, and after a long hunt by the KGB that took almost a decade because they were writing under pseudonyms, were finally caught and arrested in September of 1965. I'm speaking about Andrei Sinyavsky and Daniel. And Volkan's agenda at this transparency meeting, as he called it, was extremely limited, rather minimalist, and very typical for the movement that would follow. He didn't demand that the writers be released from custody. He didn't insist that they were innocent. He didn't condemn the government for arresting great writers in the Russian tradition, speaking the Russian word. The single most resonant demand of this demonstration was respect the Constitution, we demand an open trial, transparency, in other words. And Vulcan was convinced that if the trial of the writers were open to public scrutiny, everything that people needed to know would come out and they could judge for themselves. So this is the way the movement describes its origins, to say that that's the birth of the movement. And that is, in fact, the event that triggered what contemporaries call the chain reaction. More protests, people creating secret transcripts of the trial itself and disseminating those transcripts via samizdat, more arrests, a kind of snowball effect that would go on for over 3 years. But as you intuited, something has to happen before a baby is born, and there's a birthday. So there is a prehistory to this movement, and it has to do with Vulcan's own biography, his own encounters with the Soviet legal system and the Soviet psychiatric system, and a host of other things that culminated in his decision to organize this demonstration. But to the extent that there is an origin story, that's it.
But it's daunting to have to write about the Daniel trial. So much has been, I mean, most of what I really know about the that trial. Was it daunting to try to have to go back in the archive and uncover something new, or you would think about it, or archives infinite?
Fortunately, archives are not infinite, otherwise we would never get our work done. Yeah, it was daunting. And bear in mind, there are multiple journalistic treatments of the history of this movement that were already out there, and some of them very good. The one by Joshua Rubinstein is very good. The history of the movement by one of its participants, Lyudmila Alexeyevich, came out in 1983, is superb. I mean, she knew everyone. She had read virtually all of the relevant samizdat. She was there in the room, so to speak. But this is, I think, a common predicament for any historian who's working on the second half of the 20th century. There are going to be people who experience these things in a tactile way that you'll never be able to reproduce. So what you're describing is just one version of what the challenge faced by anybody who does recent history. But I was lucky in the sense that my very first archival foray on this project, one which I regret to say could not be done today, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, was in the archive of the Memorial Society in Moscow. You can't do it today because that society has been eliminated. Its archive has been dispersed. I don't even know where you would find the documents that I worked with. But I had a genuine eureka moment when I walked into that archive, and with the help of some of its staff members who guided me in ways that I would be eternally grateful for, I stumbled upon the diaries of Alexander St. Vulcan, this mathematician who was the godfather of the legal approach to dissent in the Soviet era. And these diaries were just mind-blowing in terms of what they revealed over the course of more than a decade about the evolution of his thought process. And once I saw him plotting this transparency meeting and watched him respond to the trial and then help organize the dissemination of the unofficial transcript of the trial, I realized that everything that I knew about the trial itself and about the agenda of the two defendants, Sinyavsky and Daniel, the writers who had been caught publishing their work abroad under pseudonyms, everything I knew about that was completely different from the way Vulcan viewed it. He had a totally different take on the trial, and that gave me a place to stand outside most of the historical literature. And to put it in a nutshell, Sinyavsky and Daniel were trying to make the case that literature, including Soviet literature, should be free from, transcend, and be outside of Soviet ideology and the Soviet legal system. That the essence of literary work was freedom. And the freedom to write and say things that you yourself might not believe, to take an experimental approach to voice and affect, tone, meaning, in ways that were just way beyond what any legal system could or should try to govern. Vulcan's view of the trial was, he didn't care about the fiction, the content of the fiction. The only thing he cared about was whether the trial conformed to the norms of the Soviet criminal code. Standards of evidence, what defendants are allowed to say, the role of the defense attorney, the soundness of the arguments, the role of the judge. So he was looking at it from a very technical, legal, mathematical point of view, if you will. And so his conclusions about the trial were just, it was a vector going in a completely different direction. That's what allowed me, I think, to have a freer hand in my own treatment of what transpired at that trial.
So they were constitutionalists. They believe in the rule of law. You know, it's not very radical and sexy. I'm curious, what happened in 1968 when there's a sort of kind of global wave of student protests. To what extent did they see themselves as part of that or doing something completely different? Because you had obviously student protesters who believed that it was the law itself was, against the problem. Freedom, yeah, it was a problem. So I'm curious kind of how they situated themselves globally.
This is a great and super interesting question. I think we are several years past the high point of global history when historians, inside joke, when historians thought that going global was sort of the highest form of doing history. I think we've stepped back from that a little bit as the world itself is calling into question whether globalization is actually a good thing or in what ways it is and it isn't. But at the high point of the sort of global trend in history writing, several attempts were made to cast the Soviet dissident movement not only as a counterpart to what was going on in Berkeley and Columbia and the streets of the left bank in Paris and Frankfurt and Berlin and any number of other places, also Beijing for that matter, Red Guards under Mao. The argument was not just that they were a counterpart, but that they were actually part of a global lingua franca of dissent. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is totally wrong. It just isn't. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Demographically, Soviet dissidents were a good decade older. They weren't university students by and large. They were people who had already launched their careers, in some cases quite successfully. Sakharov, for example, being one of the most decorated scientists in all of Soviet history, father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. And he's an extreme, but not the only example of that. So from a sociological perspective, they didn't line up with the demography of the movements in the West. They didn't speak the same language. As you noted, Soviet dissidents were rule of law types. They were anti-revolutionary. They did not want to foment revolution or topple the Soviet state. So they weren't even speaking the same language as dissenters, roughly dissenters or revolutionaries in the West. They were speaking the language of civil rights and human rights by 1968, increasingly international human rights, which was not really the language of the movements in Berkeley and Paris and other Western cities. So I do not subscribe to the idea that there's a global 1968 of which the Soviet dissident movement is a part. But there are some really interesting affinities, which almost nobody commented on at the time, but which I find I can't ignore them. I can't just walk away from them. And one of those affinities is, and this applies to part, not all of the Soviet dissident movement, is this sense of inventing new ways of living, of thinking about new ways of constructing your life and interacting with other people that break free of inherited patterns and habits and standards, not just of the state, but of the society in which you're living. There was a wing in the Soviet dissident movement that, despite its loyalty to the idea of the rule of law and strict obedience to Soviet law in an effort to inspire the Soviet state to do the same thing, nonetheless resisted laws, rules, regulations of any kind within the movement itself. It wanted a movement that was kind of anarchic, where even as people defend the rule of law, constitutions, etc., the ultimate arbiter of their activism was their own conscience. And this radical individualist, conscience-driven activism is something we do actually find in the free speech movement in Berkeley and in the student protesters of Columbia in '68 and in Paris and in very many other sites of what we think of as the sort of the Western 1968. And I'm still thinking about that affinity. I don't believe there's a causal nexus between them. I think there was very little awareness across the Iron Curtain that this was a common trait. It was a controversial trait in the dissident movement. There was another wing that rejected that, but it's an interesting sort of emotional quality within the movement.
Speaking of context, I mean, how do they put themselves in historical context and see themselves as contemporaries? What was their preferred usable path?
Yeah. So this gets back to your question about mythology and the kind of myth that they created for themselves about their place in the longer arc of Russia's history. And I say Russia as in Rossiyska, Soviet Empire. So the dissidents definitely saw themselves as the present day avatars of and who you asked, but Alexander Herzen, the Decembrists, the constitutionalists of the 1820s, in some cases going back to Radishev and the very earliest critics of serfdom as a system of social oppression. They created a pedigree for themselves that links them to the noblest, most appealing narrative that Russian history has to offer. And that is the narrative of the socially conscious intelligentsia. I mean, what better lineage would you want to attach yourself to? So I think it was very understandable and in some ways natural that they would see those people as their progenitors. But there again, I eventually had to part ways with that way of looking at them. And I was much more inclined, and am much more inclined to see them as Soviet people. And I was more struck by the differences between them and their Tsarist era alleged predecessors than I was by the similarities. Most of the radical intelligentsia in the Tsarist era had a rather contemptuous view of the rule of law. They saw law as an instrument of social control and social oppression, wielded by the Tsarist government against its own people. They also thought that law was a relic of a kind of bourgeois formalism, and that the most genuine, authentic, deepest human relationships could not possibly be expressed in the language of contract and legal obligations. They were turned off by law as an instrument of social change. There were, of course, exceptions. What I'm describing is the rule, and in history, the rule is what matters more than the exceptions very often. So I felt more the differences were more consequential than even though I recognized that their own preference was to see themselves as the descendants of the pre-revolutionary intelligentsia.
How does ordinary Russian people regard the dissident? I feel like so much of our attention is on how the West saw them, how they perceived them, or kind of misunderstood them. But I'm curious about sort of how this unfolded domestically, or annoyed that they were part of the problem. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking about how today the protesters are regarded as sort of like nuisances. I mean, wondering what it was like in the room.
Yeah, for dissidents, it was quite difficult. They were largely isolated, especially by the mid-70s, isolated from most currents in Soviet society. It's a difficult question to answer because I can't say I know a lot. I'm not sure anybody really knows a lot about Soviet public opinion. We don't have annual Gallup polls to go back to figure out what trends of public opinion were in, say, the 1960s and 70s. And we also don't have multi-party elections, which, among other things, can be used to gauge the distribution of opinion in a very crude way. The distribution of opinion according to how many people vote for party A, B, or C. So we don't have that kind of data. So we're forced, I say we, meaning historians or anybody who's interested in exploring the late Soviet history, we're sort of forced to fall back on anecdotal evidence, on reports by people who emigrated about their neighborhoods, their neighbors, their circles. but I don't think we have anything that approaches rigorous information about what people thought of dissidents during the Soviet era. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, then we started getting, mountains of data about public opinion. The problem with those expressions of opinion is that they're retrospective. And they're not just retrospective, they're looking back across this, epoch-making divide of the collapse of Soviet power. You really can't trust what people say in, say, 1995 about what they were thinking and feeling in 1985 and 1975. And I originally, when I was writing this book, I originally had a very different conclusion. The conclusion was going to sort of trace the roller coaster of the afterlife, the reputational afterlife of the dissident movement in the post-Soviet era. And it really was a roller coaster. At times they were celebrated as these freedom fighters who helped bring down the communist regime and set the various countries, the former republics of the Soviet Union, free. And then at other times they were condemned as puppets of the West who conspired to destroy this magnificent empire that commanded respect and fear all across the globe, and that they hadn't had a clue about how politics really worked. And at other times they were simply this is irrelevant. They had nothing to do with the collapse. They had nothing to do with anything. They were just, the proverbial froth on the waves of the Cold War, and we shouldn't be distracted by them the way Western journalists managed to be while they were covering them. So I was going to write a sort of epilogue about that up and down of opinion, and then the war here. And then the build up to the war in a way that was chillingly systematic. Every institutional remnant of this movement, by which I mean not just the memorial societies in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Kiev, in dozens of cities all across the Russian Federation, not just that society, but also the Sakharov Center in Moscow. It was a very important gathering point for people involved in civil society activities in Russia. And by which I mean also the Moscow Helsinki Watch Group. These are the three great institutional embodiments of whatever was left of the dissident movement in the post-91 era. These were systematically liquidated, leading up to the full-scale invasion in what I am absolutely convinced was a premeditated attempt to wipe out the likely institutional centers for criticism of that war when it finally broke out, when it finally happened. So it was done to eliminate public criticism in advance. And one of the most disheartening things about that liquidation is the near total absence of protest about it in the Russian population. Just tiny ripples of protest when these things were dismantled. And that was a terrible sign of how even in 2021, 2022, they really had failed to establish roots in the larger society. They were isolated from Russian society at large.
Why do you think that there hasn't been this kind of warm reception of Russian dissidents after the war now that there was in the Soviet era?
Reception where?
Weird. I mean, I think, after the war, I think many people sort of thought that, kind of a new wave of kind of Russian dissidents here. I did an event with Maxim Osipov, but, I sort of thought I would be doing those sort of all the time. I sort of thought there would be this, I sort of just kind of thought there would be this kind of second or, another wave, and that we would be, that part of my job as a journalist would be to cover it. And instead it's been very, very quiet, and just curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's really complicated. There was a good deal of attention when the prisoner swap was arranged last summer, and Vladimir Karamurza and other Ilya Yashin and other basically dissidents from today's Russia were freed from Russian prisons where they'd been held for their protest activities, and against their will came west. There was a very lively reception both in Western Europe and the United States, Canada, And I can tell you that Karen Murzasto has a very busy calendar because I tried to get him for an event earlier this month and it was hopeless because he's just so booked everywhere and all the time. But I think you're right, certainly in comparison with Soviet dissidents, the reception has been comparatively muted, I would say. So there are a couple of factors. One is that a lot of people feel an obligation to give pride of place to people from Ukraine because their plight is more intense, more lethal, more dramatic. And a lot of people want to break with this tradition of Russia always having center stage among the various societies that comprise the former Soviet Union. And I am sympathetic to that. I do think, though, that there's been some exaggeration of the need to put Russia on the back burner and foreground everything Ukraine. Not to take away at all, especially in the past week or two, from the truly dire circumstances of Ukrainians now that the Trump White House has essentially thrown them under the bus. But I think part of the trend of so-called decolonizing the field is to put Russians and Russia on the back burner. Beyond that, this is purely speculative, but I think there's a sentiment out there of like Russia is hopeless when it comes to democracy, and authoritarianism and highly person-centered forms of rule, disregard for the law, weakness of institutions. It just seems to be the default setting for Russia, and they have these periodic historical moments when they seem to be able to take leave of that inherited pattern. It happened in 1970, and then it seemed to be happening during the thaw, and then it seemed to be happening under Gorbachev. And early on in Putin's reign, it seemed like we were going to get a conservative, patriotic version of a rule of law state. And over again, there's this slide back into highly authoritarian forms of rule, and not a lot of pushback from the Russian population itself. And I think among some observers in the West, I do not count myself among them, but among some who might otherwise be paying more attention to dissidents in Russia today, there's just this feeling of, we can't do anything about this. This is just the way Russia is for the time being. And so they don't see any signs of hope in people who are speaking out or acting out against those trends.
When I we began and asked you about the protests of 2011 to 2012, how do you look back on those now? How do you sort of situate them within this kind of longer history? And I'm also curious what you thought at the time, and if you're, I remember being kind of discouraged by those protests. They felt very, class. I remember someone who went to one showing me his iPhone and he said, we couldn't have done this without Steve Jobs. And I remember a lot of, speaking of like Western observers, there were a lot of, in academia at the time, there were a lot of people posting photos of themselves on Facebook at John Jock, and there's just like, it's felt very like kind of glitzy and kind of superficial. And I was kind of dismissive of the whole thing, but now I feel like I was completely wrong. This was this incredible act of bravery to speak out against the regime. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious, what your thoughts were at the time and if they changed.
I'm going to preface my response by saying that I lived in, it started out as the Soviet Union in 1991, going into 1992. So by the time I left, it was no longer the Soviet Union, it was the Russian Federation. And I got there just after the August coup in 91, one of the most dramatic events in the denouement of Soviet history. And I got to meet a lot of people who had participated in demonstrations against the coup plotters, who had gone to Red Square when there were tanks on the streets of Moscow, people who had gone to the Winter Palace when there were tanks on the streets of St. Petersburg. And I would sort of touch base with them across the year to hear how they looked back on their participation in that defense of Yeltsin's Russia, and what they thought of the ensuing events: Gorbachev's resignation, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the the freeing of price controls in January of 92, the rapid inflation, the thinking of the economy, the descent of the population before my eyes into poverty. By the time I talked to people in April, May, June of 92, a lot of them were saying, gee, maybe I shouldn't have gone out to the barricades back in August. Less than 9 months later, they were questioning whether what they had stood for against the coup plotters was really the right movement. That was extremely sobering. That was extremely sobering to me. So I watched the demonstrations that started in, I guess it was December 2011, after what were just openly corrupt elections. I watched them from afar. I was not in Russia at the time, but I did a lot of reading about them. I was particularly influenced by a terrific book by Misha Gabovich called Putin Kaput. That was the German original, and then it was he translated it himself into English, which was a very close, on the ground, granular study of who the protesters were. And yes, they were all carrying iPhones. And yes, they couldn't have done it without Steve Jobs, because this was a series of demonstrations that was conjured up by social media. And as the New York Times op-ed writer Zeynep Tufekci argues, they were dissolved as easily as they were summoned. And this is a real problem with social media generated demonstrations that are not built on the weeks and years of community building that an old style political movement would have to go through before it could get that many people out on the square. So as impressive as it is, especially given Soviet history, to get 100,000 people on the streets of Moscow at the same time. And not only Moscow, by the way, there were, and nowadays, sort of smaller demonstrations in lots and lots of Russian cities, which is very impressive. But as impressive as that is, something dissidents, the transparency meeting in Moscow in 1965 had somewhere between 50 and 300 participants. That was on the larger side for transparency meetings. So as impressive as the 100,000 figure is, way beyond what the dissidents could have imagined, it wasn't a movement that was built in a way that could last. And they, not only did they not have a set of political agenda points, they didn't even try to assemble an explicitly political agenda. In that, they resembled the demonstrations that happened here on Wall Street against the 1%, which either didn't want to or was incapable of formulating a political agenda, and actually regarded calls for a political agenda as a form of coercion against the movement. So the agenda of the Moscow and other demonstrators in 2011 was limited and focused. It was against corrupt elections. It was for a reholding of parliamentary elections in a way that was free of ballot stuffing. In that sense, it kind of mimicked the alleged apoliticism of the dissident movement, not in the language of human rights, but in the language of anti-corruption. And that was the language that Alexei Navalny embraced and ran with and made a high art form in terms of protesting. But he too, in a sense, before he was killed, never really articulated a political agenda beyond fighting corruption. There were the beginnings of one, and he did run as a candidate for public office, which no dissident ever did in the Soviet era, nor could have done. But this apoliticism seems to be a thread that runs across various historical divides.
I want to monopolize your time. We have about a half an hour. We're about 40 minutes for questions. So I'd like to open it up with Yana.
Hi, fun. Thank you so much for this. I always had a question that I always wanted to ask you, and it has to do with just your career trajectory. And we began as a historian of Imperial Russia, studying Russian Jews in the second half of the 19th century. And I always was fascinated by seemingly this leap that so few people do, I think, going from Imperial to Soviet. And then very few people go from Soviet to Imperial too. But I was wondering if you could maybe explain to us, or how you understand or how you decided to make that leap from what seem to be like two very different topics. So sometimes when I think about it, I'm like, I guess you're studying in both cases, people who are both kind of straddle that line between being outsiders and insiders. In Imperial Russia, it's the Jews, and then dissidents in the Soviet period. So I kind of just always wanted to ask, like, how did you make this trajectory work for you? How do you explain to yourself, I guess?
Sure. Well, it wasn't premeditated. You can certainly say that. I'm not one of those people whose career is like a linear progression, a logical progression. Honestly, I was just kind of tired of the 19th century. I had a form of what we call academic attention disorder. I just didn't want to be living in the 19th century on and on and on. And I wanted new terrain. I wanted new cast of characters, new kinds of sources. So part of it was I was told by my then boss at Indiana University that I needed to teach a survey of Soviet history, which I had never taught before. So I was like, okay, I'll do that. And the more I started reading around, the more interested I got in the people. But there was no plan, and it was just I was just in search of new terrain, something where I could exercise different muscles. In hindsight, I can see some of the thematic continuities. I do seem, in ways I probably will never fully understand, I do seem to gravitate towards outsiders who have also a kind of insider status, internal strangers within any given system. There were a lot of Jews in the dissident movement, and that was one topic that was kind of the third rail of the movement, and in real time was whether it was really just another Jewish conspiracy against Russia. It's not. And I also see, again, in hindsight, that I've been interested in law and history and the way people deploy law, talk about law, and think about law. That's something that was one of the focuses of the book Beyond the Pale, as I look at the legal profession. And it's obviously front and center of the dissident movement. But it's not like that was the train I got on and then I found myself in the late Soviet era. It's only in hindsight that I began to see, I seem to be obsessed with certain themes that keep popping up over and over again. So, I'm a big believer in serendipity.
I just want to know that question. Great question, but it makes me feel so out of academia because I remember in the fall, I reviewed a book, like a biography of the Brothers Grimm. So I was writing about German romanticism. The next thing I was doing was on breakup coaches in the dating industry.
Yeah.
Massive lead from 19th to 20th century Russian history.
It's so massive.
That's why we're all super jealous.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. One question I had is, I was really to comment a bit more on the place of nationalities and nationality paradigm in politics in Soviet Union within the dissident, the ones that you looked at and studied, especially because you haven't talked much about maybe how Jewish dissidents, for example, maybe their aims and their understandings of what it meant to be a dissident people are so different from those of ethnic Russians. And you talk a lot about Russia within the Soviet Union, but if you had written a book, let's say, about Georgian Soviet dissidents or, Soviet dissidents in the Baltics or in Central Asia, how do you think that would have been perhaps a different book? And how do you think that those concerns were perhaps different? I don't think
Sure. Yeah. The dissident movement itself reproduced much of the ethnic diversity of the Soviet system, and it was a kaleidoscopically diverse country. Really only outdone in that dimension by a place like India. Languages and cultural traditions, every major world religion, almost every branch of Christianity and Islam are represented there. So the dissident movement itself had ethnic Russians, ethnic Germans, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Armenians, basically the name. But it was distinct from the ethno-nationalist movements that you found, especially, say, in Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia, and a handful of other of the ethnic republics in the Soviet Union. I think that the Jewish dissidents in the movement were actually not very different from the ethnic Russians in the movement. People I think you have in mind are the refuseniks, the people who were part of the Jewish immigration movement. Very often conflated with dissidents, but they're very different. Their goal is not to reform the system. Their goal is to exit the system. And many of them concluded that the less they had to do with the dissident movement, the better, because they didn't want to get tangled up in domestic political controversies. It might have complicated their ability to leave the country. Even though the dissident movement, among the many rights that it championed, was the right to live where you wanted to live, both inside and outside the country. And even though the dissident movement, especially people like Andrei Sakharov, championed the Jewish immigration movement as one example of the kind of rights that ought to be taken for granted in the Soviet Union. But the actual demography of the movements and their agendas were quite distinct. I talk about that a little bit in the book, but I have a separate article about dissidents, rights defenders, and refuseniks. The single most common criticism I've gotten of the book is of people who say it's too Moscow-centric. You really should have given more attention to the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians. They do figure in the book, but not in, I would say, not in a especially prominent way. And that's because my focus is really on the rights defenders. And there were gradations in, say, Ukraine or Lithuania among people who wanted something along the lines of greater cultural autonomy, or all the way up to full stop secession from the Soviet Union. And that's a different set of prerogatives than reforming the Soviet legal system to make it live up to its own aspirations. I do argue in the book, though, that the language of legality and the rule of law became the lingua franca not of 68 around the world, but of dissent around the Soviet Union. So Ukrainian cultural activists adopted that language. Lithuanian Catholic activists adopted that language. That, I think, is very influential.
Yeah. One of the things that's great about a book like this is that it is so rich that I think inevitably it suggests trends that almost lead not into conflict with one another, but into tension with each other. And one of them that I think is so interesting, and you resolutely, you're very clear in the argument that this is not a story about people who were out to take the Soviet Union down. I want to push you toward the end, nevertheless, in the following way. One of the threads that we didn't get the chance to talk about yet, but that is really prominent, is this idea of performance. And the notion that Soviet people, on the whole, were performing through day-to-day life. I would love to just hear more about that concept and the way that it works in the book. In your comments just now, though, it got me thinking when you said in specific that what made the dissidents unique was not that they were thinking differently, but that they were speaking differently. They were speaking their thoughts in a different way. I was so struck by the story you told of Grigorenko, who was a general, and I will let you sort of tell the whole story, but one of the most astonishing acts of real life performance that I've ever encountered. If you could share it, that would be great. However, then the question arises. I had always been taught that one of the things that makes glasnost and perestroika, especially glasnost, is that it is not that people are learning anything new, it's that they're speaking differently about things they already know. And that this is seminal to the coming of the end. Why then do we ascribe that outcome to perestroika, to glasnost? Is it because that invitation to speaking openly is coming from the state, and that's just how statist this society was? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Or is there something different in the message? Because you do talk a lot about the resonance between the dissident message and then its recapitulation as perestroika. Two other very quick ones that you don't have to answer, but I just want to put out there.
Sure.
You said this is a second generation problem. connoting a shelf-like situation. How then do we work through the Eastern European similarities, given the generational differences in those two places? And then finally, you mentioned that the economy is a big blind spot. Why?
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna try to answer them in reverse order, because I think you started with the hardest one, so I'm gonna go back for last. So why do the dissidents have relatively little to say about the Soviet economy? It's an irony that people brought up in a system in which Marxist Leninism and dialectical materialism saturated much of the school curriculum. It's an irony that products of that system were such lousy Marxists. They didn't fundamentally believe in or see any necessary connection between what Marx called the base, it's the structures of economic production and labor on the one hand, and the superstructure, politics, culture, law. They really didn't think that there was anything particularly wrong with socialism, or that any of the things that they did think were wrong about the Soviet system required any alteration of the economic arrangements. They thought you could tinker with the legal system and just, leave the free housing, free medical care, all of the scaffolding of socialism fully in place. So they were really lousy Marxists, and they were so focused on law and civil liberties as the arena of where they could maybe achieve some leverage, but they just didn't have anything to say about the Soviet economy. It didn't interest them. The most profound way in which they were not Westerners is they saw no connection between private property and liberty. That was a meaningless argument for them. And they had lots of critical things to say, actually, about multi-party systems. So this is one of many places where we really need to stop seeing them as versions of ourselves and need to listen to what they themselves said. The second question you asked was about generations. So, yeah, I'm not really sure I meant it as a shelf life. I think if Gorbachev hadn't come along and tried to fix the system by tinkering with it, we could easily be talking about third and fourth generation Soviet citizens. So the second generation didn't have to be on the road to expiration. What I think is significant about seeing them as second generation Soviets is that certain things are simply taken for granted in their world. It's like the air they breathe and the water that they drink. And I also think the timing of analogous dissident movements in Eastern Europe is also about when those countries started to become post-Stalinist. So, Prague and Budapest and Warsaw are about 10 to 12 years behind the Soviet dissident movement in developing analogous movements. And I think it's because these movements cannot arise under Stalinist conditions. And it took the secret speech in 1956 and Khrushchev in the Soviet case to unintentionally open space where a movement like this became thinkable. And similarly, it was not until the 1970s that was a analogous in East Europe. So I see the generational rhythm as telling us a lot about the timing of dissent in addition to its nature. Your first question is, what are the key words that you want me to speak to?
I mean, totally optional to answer it. But I was interested, first of all, in the nature of Soviet life as performance.
Yeah.
And of dissidence as being fundamentally oriented not around even a particular set of convictions, at least as in and this is not something I necessarily got from the book, but this is how I understood it that you framed it just now. And so I thought it would be productive conversation.
Yeah.
About thinking versus demonstrating and publicly showing, and that it is, insofar as I am teaching in class on the class that some of you are in right now, and we're talking a lot about demonstration of facts, what it means to have those little niches penetrated such that you get information about what other people think, which, as you know, is lacking.
Right.
Why is that landing? Can you talk about the ways that's landing and what else is going on to make this endeavor to be so differently than the Soviets? I'm the opposite of John, whereas I'm going hyper specific. He's like 19th century, 20th century, also now. I'm like, let's go even narrower.
Yeah, I'll try to speak to that. So one of the things that's distinctive about 20th century dictatorships, whether you are a fan of the word totalitarian or not, I myself think it does have some utility, is that 20th century dictatorships are participatory dictatorships. They mimic the mechanisms of democracy. They insist on presenting themselves as being grounded in popular consent and participation. They're not just impositions of sheer force over a population. They construe themselves as agreeing that sovereignty resides in the people and that the people are participants in this form of rule. And what that means is that they require not simply the consent of the governed, as our system puts it, but the active participation and the constant reaffirmation of popular participation in the system. So very early on, the Soviet system became performative. And some people, especially linguists and writers, started noticing this as early as the 1920s, just a few years after the revolution. There's a famous piece that actually one of your colleagues here at NYU, my Winterport has written about, where it was noted already in the mid-1920s that these revolutionary slogans were being pounded into people with such frequency, and they were being required to say them and pronounce them with such frequency that the semantic meaning of the word was no longer registering. They were being hollowed out. And this is something that just increases over time. And that the descriptor that I use in the book is that this had become a lip service state. Everybody was paying lip service to these party and state slogans in a way that was totally divorced from actual conviction. Doesn't mean that nobody believed what they were saying, but an awful lot of people were saying things, not that they believed or disbelieved, they just said them on kind of a default setting, like it was becoming automatized. If you're a Russian or Soviet historian, lip service state has a slightly funny quality to it because there have been various other versions of the service state in Russian history. And I argue that this was the late Soviet version of the service state, something that goes all the way back to the medieval era, the lip service state. So my argument is that, yes, a lot of people knew that what was being said and what they themselves were being required to say at shop floor meetings or at school meetings was not true. And some people knew what was true. But I think it's a mistake to think that everybody already knew everything by the time Gorbachev started saying we need to be more open about our own history. I think a lot of what came out in the Gorbachev era during Perestroika under the banner of transparency, of glasnost, which could also be translated as publicity or openness or whatever, a lot of what came out shocked a lot of people who did not know. The Soviet intelligentsia had this habit of seeing itself as the whole world, and they would, phrases would roll off their tongues. Everybody knows, everybody understands. What they mean is, me and my friends in Moscow, we all know. And the dissidents fell into this trap too. There was a famous dissident song, one of whose stanzas was, "We say out loud what the healthy million are thinking." They didn't know what that so-called healthy million were thinking. Nobody really knew for sure what the Soviet population as a whole was thinking because they didn't have the data. All they had was anecdotal evidence. So I do think that the dissidents started early on, which is to say in the 1960s, saying some things that some other people knew, but performing them in a way, saying them, so speaking directly to the audience in a way that was, as I described it in the epilogue, a kind of shattering of the fourth wall. If you think of this performative set of habits as being part of a theater of Soviet propaganda, What the Soviets did was they were actors in that drama, but instead of sticking with the script, they stood there on the stage and they spoke directly to the audience and they said things that were out of script. And so they shattered the illusion that theater always tries to impose on the audience, which is that you are looking at something real. You know, it's the sovereignty, it's the sovereign illusion of theater and of fiction and of poetry. And I try to argue that they shattered that illusion by speaking directly to the audience, whether the audience was the Soviet population or increasingly the Western population. And what gave those performance disrupting acts so much power is that there was a chorus in the theater that was repeating at much higher volume everything that the dissidents were saying, or almost everything that the dissidents were saying. There was a Greek chorus that was periodically entering into the performance, uninvited, and that chorus was the Voice of America, the BBC, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Deutsche Welle, Code Israel, and other shortwave broadcast systems. It gave the most fantastic, unimaginable access to the Soviet public beyond what Samizdat could ever have achieved. And so this disrupting of the theatrical performance was even more powerful than the dissidents themselves could initially have imagined. And I think, I try to be very careful about this, dissidents never meant to topple the Soviet system. Just like Gorbachev himself never meant to topple the Soviet system. What they meant to do was to spread legal consciousness and to make the Soviet government more law-abiding. They failed. They absolutely failed on both counts. But what they did accomplish, unintentionally, was to drain legitimacy from the system by not just hollowing out the official rhetoric, but by showing everybody how hollow it was, to the point where the system really did collapse faster than anyone could have imagined, like a house of cards, because it was already hollow inside. And they, among other factors, contributed to that hollowing out process. That's the sort of thing and talk of the story.
We have a question in front and two in the back.
Yeah. Thank you for the talk. I'm a French academic, and I knew a lot of dissident at that time in Paris, which was a crossroads in the mid-70s after my return from the Soviet Union. I want to say that most of them that I met, because I took interview with them, didn't claim to be dissident. When you met Alexander Zinoviev, I met Leonid Puch, Natalia Gormanievskaya, and others. They had very individualistic position, and they were all in exile. They had very little impact on Soviet society when they emigrate, before they immigrate, because either they stay in jail or either they had no connection with the main society inside Soviet Union because of the totalitarianism inside. And I think the question was not about ideology also at that time, to fight against communist ideology. The question was to make the distinction, we quote Anna, and to make the distinction between what is a truth and what is a false, what is a fact and what is a fiction. And that was their main task, to try to find a truth inside the whole Soviet life where they used to survive and to fight against. Yeah. So this is maybe a comment. Yeah.
That's one version of what they were about. Yeah. I think to leave out the rights defense and the attempt to exercise a kind of containment on the Soviet state by using its own legal system against it is an indispensable part of what the movement was about. I would also take issue, and I believe you that they said what you said they said once they were in Paris, but I take issue with the claim that they didn't have an impact on Soviet society while they were there. Let me take the three individuals you mentioned. Natalia Gormanievskaya is more responsible. She was a poet. She is more responsible than anyone else for founding and editing the Chronicle of Current Events, the Chronika Tekushych Событий, which was the most important Soviet periodical and the longest lived of all of them.
Yeah, who read it at that time inside Soviet Union?
Tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, very little. So
Well, again, small numbers of people can have an outside impact. And I say tens of thousands with a high degree of confidence, not because I did the research to find all those people, but because the KGB did that research for me. So I've seen the KGB files where they reconstruct the networks of distribution of the Chronicle. And it reached people from every major city across the 11 time zones of the Soviet Union. And even more influentially, the Chronicle made its way abroad and was broadcast in its entirety, issue after issue, by the shortwave radio stations. So I think it's entirely plausible to say that millions, possibly tens of millions of Soviet listeners had access to the Chronicle from the Western radio broadcasting. So that's Gorbanevskaya. Not even to mention the fact that she was one of the 8 people who participated in the demonstration on Red Square in August of '68, which was, as I say in the book, the most famous 15 minutes in the history of the dissident movement. Let's take Alexander Zinoviev, who was a highly original thinker, a logician like Alexander Volkin, fairly highly placed professionally in the Moscow Academy before he was essentially forced out of the country. Zinoviev wrote a number of satires of the Soviet system, the most famous of which was Yawning Heights, just a savage and extremely funny indictment of the Soviet system in every regard. He also skewered the dissident movement itself. He was an equal opportunity satirist. But a lot of people were exposed to that book, even if they didn't read it in full. And that kind of just unforgiving mockery of the Soviet leadership and of Soviet propaganda is part of a hollowing out process. So I do not share the notion that he was without influence while he lived in the Soviet Union. Zinoviev was a contrarian. So he was against the Soviet Union, and then he was against Yeltsin. He skewered the dissident movement. He was a contrarian until the very end of his life. He also had one of the most fantastic lines about the dissident diaspora in the West. He said, a lot more dissidents arrived in the West than left the Soviet Union. It's just a brilliant way of saying that people reinvented themselves for public relations purposes once they got to the West. And your third example, Leonid Dush, another mathematician from Kiev, a Ukrainian, one of the central players in the Moscow-based, rights-based dissident movement. He himself was a lifelong Marxist, had some serious disagreements with people who emphasized the rule of law over economic structures. But his case became a cause célèbre. He was de facto imprisoned in a psychiatric hospital for several years. He was subject to antipsychotic drugs to the point where he lost the ability to read and probably to think. And French activists, especially the French mathematical community, rallied to his defense and eventually got him out of the country, I believe in 1976. He went on to write a memoir, but I just don't think it's accurate to say that these people did not make an impact in the Soviet Union. They did. They became icons of a sort. Not among the entire population or even the majority of the population, but you don't have to resonate with the majority in order to make historical change. That's the point.
We have one question in the front, in the back, and then the front.
You're going to pass.
Yes.
Yes, Yulia Nichenko, the question is, you mentioned the forces and the absence of sociological data. Could we look at the cultural figures that are popular among the elite, national, agricultural, it's managerial, technical, and we take, say, two names, Zhvanetsky from Odessa, Ukraine, and take Wysocki. How do they relate to the whole movement? Would they support it? What would be the connection? Thank you.
Yeah. So just for those who might not know these figures, the reference is to probably the most famous stand-up comedian in the Soviet era, Zhvanetsky, stand-up comedian from Odessa, and the single most beloved bard, singer-songwriter, poet, Vladimir Vysotsky, sometimes called the Soviet Bob Dylan. Maybe Dylan's the American Vysotsky. So the amazing thing about Vysotsky is that everybody loved him. Politburo members listened to his bootleg tapes. Dissidents listened to his bootleg tapes and went to his concerts. They quote him in their memoirs. I have struggled to find a segment of the population that did not love Vysotsky. That's how widespread his popularity was. He never identified as a dissident. I don't think people called him a dissident. And he managed to sort of find that fine line where he could at least continue performing, although he wasn't allowed to record for many years, which is why the recordings that were made of him were all bootleg, made on people's tape recorders. But I don't see him as someone who either was or aspired to be identified with the dissident movement. He really was as close to a universal cultural figure as you could find. And by the way, not only as a guitar player and singer, but also as an actor, at the Taganka Theater. Really a figure almost parallel for me in the Soviet culture. Lots of dissidents from early on in the movement, people like Daniel Sinyavsky, Larisa Bogoraz, knew him personally because they circulated in the same circles in Moscow. But I don't recall seeing Vysotsky's signatures on any of the dissident open letters or petitions. He was careful about to what cause he lent his name. As for Zhvanetsky, pretty much the same thing, but at a lower level of intensity. I've never seen his signature on an open letter or petition. I'm by no means familiar with all of his routines and recordings, and he did have records that were made of comedy in the Soviet era. I can't think of an example where he mentioned anything remotely connected to the dissident movement by name. After the Soviet collapse, maybe, but I think it would be indirect. I mean, the one line of his that I heard sort of in 92 or 93, when I was in Moscow, was, if only we could live the way we did under communism, but without the communists. So no mention of dissidents, but I think everybody understood what he meant. Like, nobody had a beef with the socialist system. They just had a beef with the way it was run and people who ran.
Just to clarify the question, I wasn't looking for legal or participatory connection, but in terms of the spirit of their message, was it close to what the dissidents were aspiring to in the eyes of the population? Would you make another step and become a dissident after listening to 30 of Vysotsky songs?
By themselves, I doubt it, but it wouldn't hurt, and they might reinforce a sense of exiting from the mainstream of Soviet thinking. But I want to emphasize there were plenty of people, millions of people who loved Vysotsky and Zhvanetsky who wanted nothing to do with dissidents. So I see no necessary effect of exposure. Just like, some people have argued that the reason why there were so many dissidents from STEM fields, especially physics and mathematics and computer science, is that those disciplines lend themselves to the dissident way of thinking. And my response to that is, well, maybe, but the overwhelming majority of physicists and mathematicians and computer scientists did not become dissidents and did not participate in any way, shape, or form. So it's a tricky argument to make, in my view.
One more question and we are last.
Okay, I'll keep it short. You stress that for the dissident movement, this was to a large extent about the law and the constitution enforcing and working with the institutions of the Soviet state. That came very surprising to me because we learned about early Marxism, the state is going to die off, law is just a superstructure. And so what was the official place of law in Soviet ideology surrounding the dissident movement? That's the first part of the question. And then the second, you mentioned it now, a lot of STEM people in the movement. What about legal professionals who in many societies are the staple for dissident movements, lawyers, activists that know the legal system? So what were the connections of the dissident movement to the legal professionals of the Soviet state?
I'll start with the second one. There were almost no lawyers in the movement. There were a handful of lawyers, and I really do mean a handful, half a dozen, who were brave and bold enough to serve as defense attorneys in dissident trials. There were dozens of trials, and most of those handful were women. The argument has been made that they purposefully kept a distance from the movement so that they could continue to act as defense attorneys and not either be disbarred or get arrested. I think there's something to that. You're absolutely right that in NGOs and human rights organizations in the West, lawyers are almost always sort of front and center. It's true of Amnesty International. It's true of the Helsinki Watch groups. It's almost a cliche that lawyers tend to dominate the scene. And that's one of the really striking differences that despite their emphasis on law, they were all amateur lawyers, what we would sometimes call jailhouse lawyers, people who really sat down with the text of the Constitution or the Code of Criminal Procedure when they were in prison. And those texts were available in prison libraries. They were absolutely amateurs when it came to deploying the law. And they, partly for that reason, they tended to think about law in a very literal-minded way. There's a really amazing encounter between a dissident named Vladimir Bukovsky, one of these jailhouse lawyers, and his actual attorney, a woman named Dina Kaminskaya. And she's trying to show him how an attorney would argue his case. And he's saying, basically, you know nothing. I have memorized the entire legal code, and I know which articles apply to my case, and I'm going to blast the judge, with this, and this argument. And he tried and failed, and she tried and failed, but they couldn't have been more different as well. You asked about the state response to this dissident legal argument, and sort of what happens with that long ago promise about the state withering away. So one of the striking things about the dissident odyssey is that the Soviet state never responded. And I do mean never responded to open letters and petitions and demonstrations. Or perhaps I should say its only response was to arrest people and round them up. There was never a written response to things. I understand that Article 125 of the Constitution guarantees freedom of speech. No response. That's one of the reasons why eventually the dissidents basically stopped petitioning their own government, stopped trying to harness Soviet law, and shifted their tactics towards international law, especially human rights norms. And their audience became the West, Western human rights NGOs, Western governments. And that was a momentous shift for the movement and for the Cold War. But the Soviet Union the Soviet government, neither the KGB nor the Kremlin, never really responded. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I was just blown away by when I was reading the interrogation transcripts, and there are hundreds of them that are accessible, interrogation transcripts of this or that dissident, for 4, 8, 12 hours at a time in KGB prisons, was that the KGB interrogators were just utterly uninterested in what the dissidents thought. They really could not have cared less about their arguments, how they arrived at them, where they thought they were going to lead. They were just looking for evidence. Who did you get this honest text from, and who did you share it with? A complete apathy as regards the argumentative content of the movement. So there was no real response from the government. And as for the withering away of the state, I'd say that was indefinitely postponed to the communist era, which, as many of you know, is distinct from the socialist era, precisely in the sense that under communism, once class antagonism has been eliminated and there's no need for a legal system because there's no crime, and there's no crime because there's no gaps in wealth and therefore no social friction, that was all indefinitely postponed to just over the horizon. And as you know, what actually happened was that the Soviet state mushroomed and expanded almost without limit and became even more top-heavy in 1980 than it was, say, in 1960 and 1940. So none of the withering away happened, not to the legal system, not to the police, not to the state. and not to the party.
Ben and Jen, thank you both so much for this incredibly stimulating discussion today. Thanks.